Welcome to the Jay and Rob Toy Show. I'm your host, Rob McCallum, aka Rob McZaw, but I'm only half the dynamic duo promised to you every single episode. So let me bring in my brother, my Charles in charge, the Ram Man to my mechanic, Mr. Jay Bartlett. Jay, welcome, my friend. How are you doing this week?
Two awful characters, so thank you. And I assume that I'm Ram Man because of the poster. I'm good, bro. I'm here to talk toys with you. I'm excited.
Well, let's dive in, and we're gonna cover a big topic this week, and that's collecting decade by decade, looking at toys from the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, and into now. Let's start it off with the 60s, Jay. Action figures in the 60s, that's when they first started. What are some of the pros and cons of figures from the 60s, and which ones stand out for you? It's not gonna be a surprise.
Obviously, G.I. Joe is the one that stands out, and admittedly, I don't have any G.I. Joes from the 60s. I might have to look into that for the future. But G.I. Joe obviously was the very first action figure, so it's kind of hard to talk about action figures throughout time and not mention the very first one. Just the interchangeable weapons, the clothing that can be taken on and off. You can change his outfits. So you could really have one guy, like a grunt figure, and turn him into Air Force, Marine, whatever you wanted to. There's just the imagination, sky's the limit.
I just want you to put yourself in the mindset of a boy in the 60s. All of a sudden, you've had, like, leading up to like Christmas morning, say like 1963, you never had toys like an action figure. You didn't get to play with figures unless you wanted to play with your sister's Barbies and those dolls, and that's totally cool because there's a lot of play value there. But you never had something that was made for boys. And all of a sudden on Christmas morning, you get a G.I. Joe doll.
Yeah, that's...
You're like, if you were a kid in 63 or whatever, your mind would have just been blown.
Absolutely, and it's great too because the whole house would be your play set. You could have adventures on the couch, under the bed, in the backyard. You know, it would be so cool. And like I said earlier, the fact that you could change his outfits, it kept the character fresh. You know what I mean? He could be pretty much anything.
It hurts my brain to think about a world where there were no action figures. We've been lucky, you know, to have our entire lives where there's figures of some sort and seen a ton of cool options come and go, some successful, some not so successful. But to try to think of a world before there were action figures, very specifically, it just seems like a sad, empty place to me. Thank goodness for G.I. Joe.
Thank goodness for G.I. Joe. He's number one. Without him, it would be a very different place for us collectors today.
So Jay, when I say the 70s, what's the one line that you think, or what comes to the forefront of your brain as 70s action figures gets brought up in discussion?
Okay, well, we're gonna save the big space opera for a little bit later.
Battlestar Galactica, we'll talk about that.
My first experience was The World's Greatest Superheroes by Mego. My very first one was Spider-Man. Shortly after, followed by Planet of the Apes, and I had Batman and Robin. Remember Batman with the oven mitt gloves that came on and off? Those were some of my first figures in the 70s, and man, were they spectacular.
What I love about those Mego superheroes is that you had both Marvel and DC in the same form by the same company, so Batman and Spider-Man could truly team up without it being, you know, a mismatch. And again, lots of play value for where those characters are because they took a beating, they could be dropped, they could really get into some interesting, you know, combat without it doing too much damage. Fun figures for sure. I never had any, and it is on my to-do list. I definitely want to check that box, Amigo. But I guess that's all that was happening in the 70s, yeah?
Well, a little company named Kenner made figures for a little tiny independent movie called Star Wars and completely changed the way toys and films were made.
I don't think we're gonna add anything new to the conversation on the impact of Star Wars and toys and action figures. The collect 'em all mentality put right back on the back of those card backs. That's where, for me, it all starts, the hunt. It's like, collect them all. It doesn't get more pure than that for the chase to begin, to literally try to have them all. And what better of a universe to start that collecting mentality with than one that is as vast as Star Wars? I don't know if it was planned. I don't know who came up with it, but it's truly marketing genius.
It is, and the card backs of the Kenner Star Wars figures, actually, the figures were numbered, which was also genius, because I remember specifically as a kid checking off, oh, I still need 5, I still need 7, you know, whoever they were. And it really was marketing genius because you could see all of them. Later on, a lot of the lines, although they did do it on the back, they started turning it into posters through the 80s, you know, where the fold-out posters would come out. But Star Wars was the first that I remember where that, like you said, the collect-it-all mentality really took over.
Now, for the 60s, I think the biggest pro, we kind of said, obviously, is that all of a sudden there were action figures, and there weren't really many cons because there was nothing to have before, so you can't compare and contrast. The 70s, I think there's 2 big pros. One, we're getting 3 3/4 inch figures, so they're a lot easier to kind of collect a lot of them, and that whole collect them all mentality are 2 of the big pro factors for action figures of the 70s. Are there any other pros that you can think of or cons that you want to address with the 70s action figures that came out?
Well, the size, of course, the 3.75 inch, which became the staple for decades after that, was the size. And this is just what I think. I think because Star Wars, the ships in Star Wars are just as important as the characters, I think that size figure would go with those vehicles. Again, when we get to talking about modern stuff, you get to 6 inch and bigger, you just can't have those vehicles. So I think George was really smart in kind of making them that size, and then you could have your X-Wing, your Falcon, AT-ATs, you could have anything you wanted.
Well, I don't know that it was George that decided to do that, but Kenner had to produce something affordable because, of course, oil prices. G.I. Joe and Hasbro had to reduce sizes as well. And here we are in the 80s, and I've mentioned G.I. Joe already. That's only one of the huge lines that changed everything for action figures. And I think the big difference from the 70s to the 80s is now we're not producing figures based on movies specifically for the most part. So many action figure lines from the 70s were rooted in films that were playing at the cinema. But in the 80s, now there are figures being made for cartoons and the small screen. And now anybody can watch adventures every single day. All right, Jay, the golden age of action figures, 1980s. What are the lines? Let's talk about them.
What are the lines? Masters of the Universe, G.I. Joe, Transformers, just to name a few. Star Wars continuing to the mid-80s. I mean, just those 4 alone are absolute legendary franchises, and they're all still going to this day, which is insane. You think about a series that came out in the 70s or the early 80s, you could still find new toys for all of that stuff now. It's amazing when you really think about it.
And those 4, which we kind of call the big 4, and Turtles came out in the late 80s as well. So they're part of the 80s group, even though they released more figures in the 90s. They're still firmly, they're like that last echelon of figures of the golden age. Those 4 and Turtles, there's nothing that they didn't kind of affect after the fact. Every single action figure that's being released today owes something to either G.I. Joe, Transformers, Masters, TMNT, and Star Wars. Whether it's the collect 'em all, the play feature, the sheer number of figures released or vehicles, the changing and transform function that is inherent to a Transformer, or just the wacky an action figure could be anything mentality that Turtles shows us. But enough praising. What are the cons from the 80s action figures if we dare dip our toes into that direction?
The first thing that comes to my mind, and I don't know, Rob, if this is actually a con or if we were just blessed or cursed, I don't know, but there were so many different lines to collect for. I was lucky enough that, my mom just dove right in with me and she got me. I have representations of most of these, so I was very lucky. But my point is there were so many different franchises. You know, there's Mask, Inhumanoids, Black Star, She-Ra. I could just go on and on. There was so many that really picking and choosing 1 or 2, because let's be obvious, we weren't working, we didn't have jobs, we couldn't, we were kids, right? So I think it's a little bit of a curse that there was so many great franchises, and now you and I both know as adult collectors, we're now going back. And it's like, I remember this franchise, I remember that franchise, and now we're starting to grab all that stuff. It's getting pretty expensive.
The 90s, Jay, is it as good as the 80s, do you think? Or do we take a left turn? or does it get better?
I'll just say my own personal point of view, I think the 80s were much better. I think the franchises were much better, but that's all just personal preference, right? If you're a kid who was born in the 80s and grew up in the 90s, you probably think that stuff is better than the 80s and 70s. I don't know. What do you think? That's a tough one.
Well, I think that there's a lot of pros for the 90s stuff, and I'm gonna throw a few at you. I remember distinctively you and I playing superheroes a lot in the early 90s, and we were both blown away at the fact that, probably off of the fumes of the success of the action figures in the 80s, everybody in the early 90s in particular up to the mid 90s was pumping out lots of action figures. So we finally got a lot of the deep cut superhero figures that we wanted. We got all the Fantastic Four, we got all the X-Men characters, because before, up to that point, all we had was like Wolverine. We got stuff like Darkwing Duck with the Thunderquack and that whole line as well. And of course, movie maniacs start to come out as well, and we're starting to get the stuff from McFarlane, and we're seeing the emergence of the adult collector stuff in the 90s too. So variety for me and deeper cuts and pushing characters and figure options into further reaches is where the pros are for the 90s, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I would agree with you. Comic books were absolutely on fire in the early 90s. When we were collecting and reading them, for sure. So you had great stories like the Infinity Gauntlet, you had Jim Lee's X-Men coming out. They were making all those characters because comics were so hot that every one of these figures sold. I don't remember any peg warmers for any of the Toy Biz stuff.
The toys and action figures I played with when I was young, I loved erector sets, and then I loved a bag full of little green army men. And I would build outside in the backyard a fort, and I think I had green army men and gray army men. And so the green army men would be in one fort fighting against the gray army men in another fort. The way you played with figures back then was you fought against one another, right? So the green army men were good guys and the gray army men were the bad guys, and I made pretend battles and had throw rocks at the gray guys and try to knock them over, shoot rubber bands at them, stuff like that. So it was good versus evil. Well, I think action figures in the 80s, it was really important because girls, let's face it, girls had their figures. They had Barbie and Dawn and other female dolls to play with. Boys didn't have all of that until G.I. Joe and Star Wars and He-Man and the Marvel characters and the DC characters came along. So it was really an important way of encouraging imaginative play with boys. And I was also involved a little bit in the Japanese characters, which became Transformers, or the ones that became GoBots. We actually had the rights to GoBots at Mattel and ended up not doing it. We ended up doing Shogun Warriors. I don't know if you remember Shogun Warriors, but Shogun Warriors emanated from Bandai and Toei Studios in Japan. And it was all these great characters, Mazinga Z, Raidun, Dragoon, and they all had powers. And of course in the Japanese television shows, again for the imaginative play in the television shows, a young boy actually controlled these monster characters by being in their head and controlling what they did. Now, that didn't translate that well initially to the United States, but that's where Transformers and GoBots came from Japanese television shows, and again encouraged imaginative play. Well, you remember when we developed He-Man and Masters of the Universe, we had a successful toy line for the period of time. You know, the early 80s, we were doing about $70 million in revenue, which was above the goal that we had set for it. But the chairman of the board of Mattel came into my office one day and he said, well, it's nice that you've got this $70 million product line, but it'll never be like a Star Wars or a G.I. Joe because you don't have a television show and you can't get one. And I said, you want to bet? And that's when I had Joe Morrison and Jim Wims start working, looking around, and we found some consultants that helped us, and then we found Lou Scheimer at Filmation Studios. And Lou loved the idea of doing a television show based on He-Man and Masters of the Universe. And it was just a great experience. I don't know if you remember, but we had Chaim Saban wrote the original music. Chaim Saban and Suki Levy wrote the original music for the He-Man Masters of the Universe television show. Having the television show enabled us to then show the world what He-Man and Masters of the Universe was really all about, to show the storylines, the stories that children could then recreate in their rooms, their living rooms, or outdoors. And it drove the revenue, helped drive the revenue of the product line from $70 million to over $500 million. So it obviously was very, very important in terms of the success of the male action line. When we did the television show, we really thought we were going to lose money on the television show. Internally, that was our decision. We put up $3.5 million, and Group W Westinghouse put up $3.5 million, and it cost about $7 million in those days to do 65 half-hour episodes. Well, to our surprise, when we gave the shows to the stations to run, in return, they gave us advertising time back. We could use that advertising time for our other toys, not for He-Man Masters of the Universe, but for other toys, or we could sell it. Well, the show ratings were so high that we were selling advertising time to McDonald's, to Kellogg's, to General Foods, and we made a profit in the first year off of the television show. Much to our amazement, we recouped our $3.5 million investment in year one. And of course, the show went on for many, many years, and we made a lot of money off of the television show, as well as, of course, building the toy line and the toy revenue. So I think they each benefited one to the other, probably equally.
Let's talk 2000 to now. I mean, I know we're combining 20 plus years of toy history there, a couple decades, but I think there's just so much overlap between everything that happened from 2000 to 2010 and beyond that it's a worthy discussion as a whole. Where does your mind go when we start talking about action figures after the year 2000?
Well, you had a lot of film-based figures. There's a lot of fantastic films that came out in the 2000s, you know, in late 90s. We had Star Wars, The Matrix, Lord of the Rings. All those huge franchises came out and had a ton of figures. So there was that. For me, it was Star Wars. The three prequel movies came out, and in between there, Hasbro had purchased Kenner, and they were just throwing out every little B-side character that crawled across the screen for 2 seconds. Any droid that ever made a whistle that showed up on screen a little bit, there's a figure. And I absolutely loved it. I was in heaven. I love all that stuff, all those characters that don't get the love they deserve. So for me, it was a really cool time where you're just buying up all these Star Wars figures.
Well, it's that time again for Action Figure Spotlight, and in this episode, it could be a figure from any decade, just something that you want to kind of call attention to, Jay. I'm going to go first, because I'm sure you've got a pretty cool deep cut or something that means something awesome to you. I want to pull a newer figure. I'm going to pull a newer figure for Action Figure Spotlight, and that is Splinter from the TMNT Ultimates. You know, I have a rule when it comes to action figures. I want the definitive version, or I don't want it at all. I don't want to have some weird variation. I want to have that best possible version. And when it comes to TMNT, I'm a huge Splinter fan. The original Playmates figure is just amazing. And what has Super 7 and the Four Horsemen done? They've given me an adult collector version that is a perfect representation of the original, but improved upon in so many ways. I have both a cloth and a plastic tunic for Splinter here, or a gi. I've got weapons that are painted. I've even got a cup of coffee here, or tea, that has smoke that's rising from it. And there's scrolls. It's just a fantastic figure where all the little accessories really add play value and pay homage to the original figure that I played countless hours with. To this day, when I pick up that original figure, I get goosebumps because I have instant flashes of all the playtime adventures I had. So having this one, which will definitely be a rule of 2 figure once I can find another one, having this one is just the best figure maybe in the last 20 years that I've added to my collection.
You know what's interesting real quick about that is that your rule of 2 is different from mine, where I won't open any of them until I have 2. So it's like I always keep it in the box, and if I can't find another one, that one stays in the box. You do the opposite. You kind of open it and then you try and find another boxed one. Very interesting.
I think it's important to free them from their plastic prison. That's just me.
So mine, I think either one of us could have pulled this one out, and I know this is one of your favorite figures of all time. I've just recently acquired this one. It's been one that's been missing from my collection since probably the 80s, which he is from, and this is probably my favorite superhero figure of all time. This is, of course, the 1985 Superpowers Batman from Kenner. This is the Batman that I love the most. This is not based on the Adam West, but this is the 80s comic book Batman, and of course from the Justice League cartoon. I love it. We were talking about the quality of these figures, and he even still does his little power punch when you squeeze his leg. The gimmicks on these figures, I'm not usually one for gimmicks, but the superpowers never bothered me because it wasn't intrusive. He didn't have a big, latch on the back sticking out. He has a cloth cape that is cut just like Batman. It flows perfectly, and let me tell you, it's all about the color scheme for this figure. It's just incredible. And when you have Robin by his side and that fantastic Batmobile vehicle, this is pretty much one of the most perfect figures out there.
And you gotta have their capes up out of their seats when they're in the Batmobile. It's gotta look like they're flying back.
Of course, he can't be like sitting on his cape. No. He's gotta be action. And look at this one. All these years, and I guarantee you this one's been played with like mad, and the paint job on the Kenner stuff was so good, the bat symbol is still intact.
So that'll do it for another episode of the Jay and Rob Toy Show. Jay, when we're talking about decades in action figures, which decade do you need to work on in terms of your collection? Which shelf, if every shelf is a different decade, is the barest that you want to complete going forward? You want to fill those gaps?
I would say 60s. I need some in the 60s and 90s for sure. The one I want to work on the most is still the 80s. There's so much awesomeness in the 80s, but I need 60s and 90s to kind of round out the collection.
Yeah, I want to say 90s because there's some really obscure stuff in there, and I kind of just want to hunt down and do my research to see what gems I might not know about. The 80s, there's obviously a lot of heavy hitters, but I think there's a lot of cool stuff in the 70s that I'm not quite aware of. So, this is the collecting curse. You could make a case for any era as long as you just keep collecting.